So I'm here with Friedrich Wulf from Friends of the Earth Switzerland, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to enlighten us a little bit about RED, which is an acronym which is common here in the UN process, but which for our viewers means reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this is one of the kind of more technical aspects of the talks. So I'm hoping that Friedrich is going to be able to open this up and make it a little bit more accessible, which is quite a challenging task. Perhaps we could begin with asking, what is RED and how does it work?
Well, the basic idea is to use the carbon stored by forests to account for that in order to reduce additional emissions of carbon. A huge amount of the world's carbon is stored in forests. About 10% to 15% of all the carbon emissions come from forests. So that's a very good point to tackle that, and it's a very simple measure. You just leave the forest standing. That's the original idea.
Okay. And it's one of the issues where, coming into these talks, there was a lot of optimism. I think I read an article a couple of weeks ago saying that RED is going to be one of the promising points from Bonn, and it's likely to be one of the only really positive outcomes leading to Cancun, which are the talks coming up in Mexico at the end of the year, the big climate summit. And yet, on the other hand of the coin, we're also hearing people saying actually there's problems and there's risks to indigenous populations. Jamie and my colleague and I were in town the other day where there's a big protest by the Klima Forum and Climate Camp saying that this is a market mechanism which is risks causing real harm. So kind of what are we seeing so far in these talks? Are we seeing progress or more problems?
Well, generally, on the outcomes of Copenhagen, indeed, RED was one of the topics that got the most advanced of every topics. There were 3 papers in the pipeline, and 2 of them even got decided upon. And now it's about the so-called LCA. That means the text that is discussed by the non-Kyoto Protocol, by the developing countries. And this is being used as a basis for the discussion now. Again, in today's negotiations, many parties voiced that they were fine with using this as a starting point. So in the general, we're pretty far advanced, but one, of course, has to keep in mind that there are still some key issues that need some resolving.
So these technical issues, it's a political issue and it's a technical issue, and there's the problem with political problems between developing and developed countries.
The problem is that, for example, we want to have targets, as we would be happy to have a reduction or to stop deforestation at some point in time at all. And developing countries say, hey, RED is supposed to be voluntary, so we can't have any overall targets to keep the forests. We just do whatever we're paid for or whatever we agree on, and that's it. But we can't agree to any overall target that was set by Africa today.
So this is it a kind of question between whether we should be reducing deforestation at a national level or whether it should be at a local level? Is that a correct interpretation? Because people, presumably governments and maybe even sub-government bodies like organisations are going to be paid to protect forests. That seems to be the basis of this agreement. And yet there's some evidence with similar plans in the past that if you pay maybe one region to protect its forests and it achieves that, then the loggers, the people who are chopping down the trees, they move next door and they chop down the forest 50 miles down the road, and it doesn't actually stop carbon going into the atmosphere. So is the argument on from developed countries, are they saying actual deforestation has to stop at a national level? Is that the kind of the dynamic, or where's the contention? Where's the problem?
Yeah, the expectation. The problem is in the details. The options are all on the table, I think. It's just a question how these options get decided. That makes RED from a good tool, potentially, to a terrible tool. The worst case scenario is if we have an option to just push the deforestation elsewhere. If you have the option to have what is called leakage, to protect one parcel of forest, but then do it somewhere else instead. Nothing is gained. So that's why we as NGOs or many NGOs say we want to have national level accounting, to have an overview, to see what happens on the country as a whole, or even better yet, to have an international accounting, to see what happens worldwide to prevent international leakage.
And where do the various kind of countries stand on this in the talks? Is this something that's being embraced by rich countries or by developing countries? What's the dynamic here in Bonn with regards to this issue?
Well, there are only a few countries left that really want to articulate subnational accounting. They have their specific reasons. They have their projects that are already ongoing, and they think they have advantages for doing it themselves. I'm not so unconfident that this is an issue that can be resolved. What is more pressing is the question of the overall financing mechanism, and the question whether you can offset any emission reductions in the north by simply buying credits from the south.
Okay.
And we see a huge danger there that industrialized countries will, instead of reducing their own emissions, which is urgently necessary, just say, hey, it's much cheaper to buy credits from the rainforests and get our get our own reductions reduced that way.
And is there a danger here that we could see actually really very negative consequences as well? Because there's a lot of activists are saying that there's a risk to indigenous peoples in these forests, that RED doesn't really take into account their rights and the fact that they've been living in these forests for many years.
Yeah.
And so actually you could have a situation where rich countries are using this mechanism to offset their own emissions so that they don't have to make real substantive changes, and also people living there are really harmed by the process. Is this something that's on the horizon? Is this a real danger?
Yeah, those are two of the main problems. One thing which I just addressed is being, of course, pushed if you have a market mechanism. Then you can just buy credits. So that's why many NGOs say we rather prefer to have a fund-based mechanism which has some sense of standards, of controls, that the money comes from is additional, and you can't get rid of your own obligations by saving the rainforest. And the other point you were raising is, of course, the safeguards. I mean, if you use this RED mechanism, it is mainly for carbon, but forests are more than carbon. They are the home of many people, of indigenous who own the land. They are the home of many plant and animal species, so hotspots of biodiversity. And you can't just ignore this. You have to have safeguards for the people's rights. You have to have safeguards for biodiversity, which are also controlled.
And is that something that there's been progress on in these talks? Because I know biodiversity has been a big issue, the prospect that countries might be able to include plantations, so potentially palm oil plantations or other types of kind of forests that actually don't contain the same biodiversity and don't have the same kind of value necessarily as a rainforest or as a natural forest. Is this loophole still open? Is this something that's still a problem, or are we kind of closing it?
In part it is open, in part it's closed. So there has been progress in Copenhagen, in fact, and I think where we can be quite happy, and I've talked with indigenous people's organizations like Tebteba about this, the indigenous people's rights issue has been quite well addressed now. So the safeguard is in there without brackets, and so I think we're on a good track there. Of course, you always have the question of implementation, but in the text, yes. But biodiversity isn't as well off. Of course, we have a wording to have of natural forests in there. We have an anti-conversion safeguard. That means that you're not allowed to cut down natural forests in order to have plantations on the same spot. But if you look at the measures that are eligible under RED, and it's not only RED, as you introduced, it's RED Plus now. That means you also have afforestation, for example. All these measures, from keeping the natural forests intact up to afforestation measures by monocultures on totally unsuitable land, all are eligible for funding at the same level. So there's no priority for biodiversity there, and we do see some dangers there.